On Thursday, ALBA TCP member countries strongly rejected the interference of the Secretary-General of the Organization of American States in Bolivia's internal affairs. Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has announced early parliamentary elections to be held on June 20th. Russian President Vladimir Putin has responded to remarks by his US counterpart Joe Biden, saying they reflect the United States' own troubled past and current problems. From the headquarters of teleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South, I'm Katrina Goss. On Thursday, member countries of the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America People's Trade Treaty forcefully rejected the interference of the Secretary-General of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, in Bolivia's internal affairs. In a statement published on the bloc's Twitter account, ALBA TCP warned the international community about such acts, which are a serious violation of the principles and purposes of the United Nations. The bloc also denounced that such moves only promote scenarios of confrontation and destabilization and undermine the democratic processes of the Bolivian people. Likewise, ALBA TCP members ratified their support and solidarity with the Bolivian people and the government of President Luis Arce. This Thursday, representatives of the governments of Argentina and the United Kingdom signed an agreement requesting the International Committee of the Red Cross carry out further forensic work to identify the remains of Argentine soldiers killed during the Malvinas War. This agreement establishes a new humanitarian project plan, including the required legal framework and all technical details of the forensic efforts to exhume and identify human remains belonging to a number of individuals located within a mass grave in the island's Darwin Cemetery. The move, shortly before the 39th anniversary of the beginning of the war, represents the continuity of Argentine state policy established by the national government in 2012, when it requested the collaboration of the International Red Cross Committee to make possible the identification of 122 Argentine soldiers buried at the cemetery. The Mexican government announced a plan to rescue the country's hydrocarbons industry this Thursday. The strategy will be outlined by President Andrés Manuel López Obrador in the southern state of Tabasco. The initiative is based on the discovery of an oil field in the region, which could provide 600 million barrels of oil for the country. The government proposal seeks to strengthen Mexican sovereignty over its natural resources, as the energy reform promoted by former President Enrique Peña Nieto solely benefited the private sector by granting 107 oil production contracts. In Peru, over 40% of eligible voters remain undecided ahead of the April 11th general elections. According to the latest poll conducted by the Latin American Strategic Center for Geopolitics, 47% of the electorate is undecided as to which presidential candidate to vote for in April. The poll also indicates that 66% of the population has a negative view of the administration of current President Francisco Sagasti, while 40% believe there is a need to reform the current constitution.
De ser así, será minoritario en un Congreso fragmentado, dominado por el Partido Acción Popular y otras tres.
Also in Peru, hundreds of transporters blocked the main roads of the capital, Lima, and other cities as part of the national strike action against the increase in fuel prices. In response to the failure of talks with the government, which lasted more than 10 hours, the sector union has extended the strike action, which has been ongoing for the past 4 days. President Francisco Sagasti stated that the strike must end to avoid affecting the transportation of medical supplies to fight the coronavirus pandemic. In addition to the rise in fuel prices, transporters are protesting an increase in toll rates, as well as voicing other labour demands. In Colombia, another indigenous leader was assassinated on Wednesday, bringing the total number of murdered social leaders and human rights defenders so far this year to 34. Maria Bernanda Huajiboy, mayor of one of the 15 indigenous communities in the southwest department of Putumayo, was killed alongside her granddaughter. The incident occurred as she was travelling, accompanied by her daughter and granddaughters, on a motorcycle in the municipality of Valle del Guames. Wahiwoy and her companions were intercepted by armed men who shot at the Indigenous leader and her 1-year-old granddaughter. Municipal authorities are inspecting the crime scene. The Caribbean island of Curacao saw its final election debate on Wednesday ahead of the general elections to be held on Friday, March 19th. The vote comes amid political tensions between the ruling coalition formed by the Real Alternative Party and the Man Party and 2 opposition parties. Polls conducted earlier this month show the current governing coalition is likely to lose seats and its right to form a government. Currently leading the polls are the centre-right Movement for the Future of Curacao Party and the Christian Democratic National People's Party. However, a Kenneth Centrum Research Institute survey shows that 38% of voters are unwilling to reveal their intended candidate, leaving election day outcomes uncertain. This Thursday, US Vice President Kamala Harris swore in Deb Holland as US Secretary of the Interior. Holland is the first Native American to become a cabinet secretary and will oversee a massive agency responsible for roughly 1/5 of land in the United States, including its many Native American reservations. The Congresswoman was approved by the US Senate by a vote of 51 to 40. Holland, who hails from New Mexico's Laguna Pueblo tribe, already made history in 2018 when she became one of the first 2 Native American women elected to the US Congress. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa expressed his condolences on the passing of Tanzanian President John Magufuli.
We also received the sad news about the passing of President Magufuli, President of Tanzania. I spoke to Her Excellency Vice President Hassan this morning and conveyed the condolences of the people of South Africa to the government and the people of Tanzania, our sister country, on their loss. As we all know, Tanzania is a country that stood with us during our struggle for freedom and sacrificed a lot, halting and delaying their own development so that we could be free.
Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan announced early parliamentary elections on Thursday to be held on June 20th. The PM explained that the decision seeks to lift the country out of its current political crisis. Pashinyan had previously indicated that he was ready to call early elections amidst demands for his resignation from anti-government movements and some military sectors. The calls came following the Russian-brokered deal with Azerbaijan to end the conflict in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, which some sectors of the country rejected. French Prime Minister Jean Castex announced massive new containment measures on Thursday to curb what he says is the appearance of a 3rd wave of the COVID epidemic. The PM detailed that measures will be applied for 4 weeks from Saturday in 16 departments of the country. He also insisted that the restrictions would not be as strict as in the past. Non-essential businesses will close and movement outside will be restricted in the affected regions, but schools will stay open and outdoor exercise up to 10 kilometers from home will be allowed. And the French Prime Minister also explained that while nurseries and primary schools and colleges will open as normal, all high schools will switch to half capacity in the 16 departments affected by new restrictions. More than 2/3 of high schools were already operating at half capacity prior to the announcement of the new measures. And France will resume its COVID-19 vaccination programme using the AstraZeneca shot from Friday, after the European regulator concluded that the vaccine was safe and effective. Prime Minister Jean Castex himself will be vaccinated with the shot on Friday as a means to allay fears. The Spanish health minister announced that the country will resume AstraZeneca vaccinations next Wednesday after Europe's medical regulator said the jab is safe and effective and not associated with a higher risk of blood clots.
I would like to make, and that has been made by the EMA too, is that the AstraZeneca vaccine is a safe and effective vaccine. So I announced that we are restarting the AstraZeneca vaccination next week, on Wednesday to be precise.
And as mentioned, the European Medicines Agency said on Thursday the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine is not linked to an overall increased risk of blood clots.
Thank you very much, Maria Agnes, and good afternoon.
About 7 million people have now been vaccinated in the EU with the AstraZeneca vaccine, and 11 million have been vaccinated.
PROC also concluded that it's very important that these events are rare. As of last night, 7 cases of this disseminated intravascular coagulation. Thank you very much, Maria Agnes, and good afternoon.
About 7 million people have now been vaccinated in the EU with the AstraZeneca vaccine, and 11 million have been vaccinated.
PROC also concluded that it's very important that these events are rare. As of last night, 7 cases of this disseminated intravascular coagulation.
This Thursday, Italy's Prime Minister Mario Draghi paid tribute to the more than 100,000 victims of COVID-19 in the country, while the pandemic continues to weigh on hopes for national recovery. Much of the country went back into lockdown on Monday to contain a third wave of the virus, while its vaccination efforts have been undermined by the AstraZeneca row. The Prime Minister unveiled a new vaccination strategy at the weekend that aims to massively speed up inoculations to cover 80% of the population by September. Italy badly needs relief from the pandemic that started 13 months ago, which has claimed more than 100,000 lives in the country so far and triggered a recession which has put almost 500,000 people out of a job. In Paraguay's capital, Asunción, the University Clinics Hospital is on the verge of collapse due to the increase of COVID-19 patients and a lack of medical supplies. The public facility, reliant on the National Medical University's funds, faces a severe lack of resources. Also known as the Hospital of the Poor, the healthcare institution is struggling to avoid collapse 1 year after the start of the pandemic. Paraguay is facing an upsurge of the pandemic with an average of 40 deaths and 2,000 infections per day in the country. The situation has seen thousands of Paraguayans take to the streets to denounce the mishandling of the crisis by President Mario Abdo Benitez and Vice President Hugo Velázquez.
This deficit in the budget for the acquisition of medicines is transferred to the patient's pocket. Today, many patients' families have to buy supplies that we are unable to acquire.
We have supplies, but not enough for the patients we currently have, because we have more than 120 patients at the moment. The number of patients has multiplied right now, and we are working very intensely.
Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Thursday that his US counterpart Joe Biden's remarks about him being a killer reflect the United States' own troubled past and current problems.
I remember when we were young and would bicker out in the yard, we would say, "I am a robber and you're glue. Bad names bounce off me and stick to you." This is not just a silly childish proverb. The meaning is psychological, quite deep. We always see our own qualities in other people and assume that they are just like us. The US think that we are the same as them, but we are different people. We have a different genetic code and cultural and moral values, but we know how to defend our interests. We work with them, but in those areas in which we are interested ourselves, and on terms that are beneficial for us, they will be forced to contend with this. They will be forced to contend with this despite all their efforts to stop our development, despite their sanctions and insults. They will be forced to contend with this on our part in accordance with our national interests. We will develop relations with all countries of the world, including the United States.
And Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova stressed on Thursday that the United States had caused an impasse in the relations between Moscow and Washington.
In fact, our intention was to invite the ambassador of the Russian Federation in Washington for consultations with the Russian government departments on the state of bilateral relations between the United States and Russia. This is a step which can't be remembered by anybody over recent years and decades. There is unprecedented. The US led to the impasse, not only relations with Russia, but I think their own ideology is an impasse. So what's next? They use the Russian factor as a holy grail, as a certain relic, mentioning all the time all that is linked to Moscow, to the Kremlin, to Russia. What is next?
On Thursday, Lebanon's Prime Minister-designate Said Hariri stressed the urgent need to form a government to relaunch talks with the International Monetary Fund and tackle the country's economic crisis. Beirut began talks with the IMF in May last year, but they soon hit a wall. The government of the time resigned after a massive explosion in Beirut port last August. In recent weeks, the Lebanese pound has continued to plummet to new lows against the dollar on the black market and has lost almost 90% of its value compared to a year and a half ago. The economic crisis has also been aggravated by the measures to contain the coronavirus pandemic. Israel is among the main promoters of the terrorist war imposed on Syria. Damascus has stressed that over the last 10 years, Tel Aviv has not ceased to offer its support to extremist groups operating on Syrian soil, as well as launching airstrikes on the country. Our correspondent, Hisham Wanas, has the story.
In the last 2 years, Israel committed more than 200 airstrikes against Syria. The last one, which is the 7th of its kind so far this year, took place on Tuesday night, March 16th, with missiles launched from the occupied Syrian Golan against the southern perimeter of Damascus, and, like the previous attacks, it was countered by the air defense of the Syrian Arab Army. These are failed attempts to save the defeated terrorist gangs, which will be answered in due course, says the government and citizens of the Arab country.
Syria is ready to respond to any aggression, and the Syrian Arab Army is prepared to face Israeli aggression against Syrian territory as part of the war against terrorism and its sponsors, especially the Zionist entity, the main sponsor of terrorism in Syria.
Damascus denounces that the Israeli entity, since the beginning of the terrorist war in 2011, has supplied huge amounts of money, weapons and ammunition to extremist groups that promote violent confrontation in Syria. This was confirmed when the Syrian army discovered several warehouses of Israeli-made weapons and food in the liberated areas in southern Syria, near the occupied Syrian Golan.
The Israeli aggressions take place in the context of continuous logistic support of Israeli entity to the terrorist groups operating in Syria to destabilize the whole region. There are intelligence reports that said that Israeli entity reactivated terrorist cells that attack positions of the Syrian Arab Army in the southern region of Syria.
The Israeli entity employs all means to prevent the total defeat of the terrorists operating on Syrian soil. Besides the continuous bombing and the supply of weapons and ammunition, the Israeli occupation troops transfer wounded extremists to occupied Palestine for treatment and then return them to the battlefields in Syria. Hostile practices that Damascus claims will not prevent the inevitable victory of the Syrian Arab Army against terrorism and its sponsors.
Protesters in Myanmar took to the streets of the southeastern city of Dawei on Thursday, despite the fear of repression by security forces. Around 100 students, teachers and engineers marched through an area in the small city, which has become a hotspot for the opposition to the February 1st military takeover. In earlier weeks, tens of thousands joined such demonstrations, but numbers have fallen since police and soldiers began firing live ammunition into crowds. At least 5 people have been killed by security forces in Dawei. As of Tuesday, 200 people had been killed and nearly 2,200 arrested or charged across the country. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived in Anchorage, Alaska on Thursday to meet with senior Chinese diplomats for the first face-to-face talks between the two powers. Tensions between Washington and Beijing remain high after relations were heavily damaged under the Donald Trump presidency, which saw a trade war and spats over everything from defense to technology and rights in the Chinese territory of Hong Kong. Blinken and White House National Secretary Advisor Jake Sullivan were set for talks with senior Chinese official Yang Jiechi and Foreign Minister Wang Yi on Thursday. Anchorage was considered a more neutral meeting ground than Washington or Beijing for the three-session summit that will conclude on Friday morning. But expectations are limited on both sides. And we've come to the end of this news brief. Remember, you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Katrina Goss and thank you for watching.